Hey guys, welcome back to Unqualified Professional, and today we're taking a look at one of the most controversial Spider-Men to ever be in the Marvel Universe. So let's get right into it. This Spider-Man first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 149 as Spider-Clone. And yes, I said Spider-Clone. Now, you may be wondering, what does that mean exactly? Spider-Clone is exactly what it sounds like. He's a clone. And this comes from a time in Spider-Man comics where they were going through a thing called the Clone Saga. And Peter Parker was a more or less mystery at this point because there was a big controversy that was going on as to who the real Peter Parker was, because we had this clone that was roaming around as him, and nobody really knew who was the real one. They were told different things constantly. So I'll give you a little bit of history and catch you up on it. So basically what happens is there's this guy named the Jackal. He goes off and he gets part of Spider-Man's blood and takes the DNA from it and starts creating clones of Spider-Man. And the one you see here is actually one of those clones. Well, Peter ends up getting in a fight with Jackal, and whenever the fight ensues, eventually he ends up blowing up the lab that everything is taking place in. And Peter escapes and grabs a hold of the clone and takes him and more or less buries him. Peter, thinking the clone is dead, buried him, like I said. And thus, it turns out that the clone wasn't really dead. The clone makes his way out and sees Peter embrace Mary Jane Watson, which is Spider-Man's love interest for those of you who don't know. Now, whenever he sees this, he determines that he must be the clone because there's no way his feelings for Mary Jane could have become as strong as what he's seeing right now. He doesn't feel that he could truly be the real Spider-Man, so he sets off on his own way. He goes and meets a man named Seward Trainer who helps him as he is trying to come to terms with who he is, what he is. And during this time, he takes upon the name Ben Reilly. And Ben Reilly comes from Ben being from Uncle Ben, and Riley coming from the maiden name of Aunt May. And so Ben tries to live a normal life for a while. He becomes a janitor. He falls in love. And things don't really turn out for him that well. He constantly has all these tragedies befalling him over and over and over, with nothing really to prove or to show how he's doing in life, that it's not terrible for him. And his first love actually ended up committing suicide. So he moved on and tried to start all over again. But whenever he did, a woman found interest in him, and her father was actually a mafia boss. And he did a background check on Riley, who at this time was under an alias, trying to live just some semblance of normalcy. And basically the boss found inconsistencies with how his work was going, gaps in time that couldn't be accounted for. And so Riley left. Riley booked it out of there, that way nothing could potentially befall him, her, anybody. And he had also around this time found out that Aunt May's health was failing, which prompted him to return back to New York City, which at first angered Peter as they both distrusted each other heavily. And at this point in time, they eventually came to terms with each other and started fighting alongside each other. And they fought crime for a while, and Ben took upon the name the Scarlet Spider, and this was his original costume, is what we're seeing now. So as time kind of progressed and they fought alongside each other, Seward Trainer appeared again and told Ben and Peter that Ben was actually the real Peter Parker, and that that Ben, like I said, was the real Peter Parker, and Peter Parker that we had grown up with and known was actually the false. He was the clone. And this confused many readers, caused many readers to become very hateful towards the series. They felt betrayed and didn't know what to really say or do. Well, before this, Peter had actually left and kind of given up the whole Spider-Man thing because Mary Jane was actually turned out to be pregnant, but Ben refused to take upon the name Spider-Man. And so, with Peter having found out that he is supposedly the clone, he pretty much gives everything up. And eventually, Ben Reilly takes over the mantle of Spider-Man completely and totally. Although he does not take upon the new suit. He doesn't want it. He creates his own suit. And so later on, he actually ends up finding the Carnage symbiote from Cleo's Cassidy and bonds with it so that it won't hurt anyone else. And for a short time, he is actually able to control the symbiote and make sure that it is under control and doesn't do anything horrible, doesn't kill anyone or anything else. Eventually, the symbiote is debonded from Ben Reilly, and he then goes on to kind of live a semblance of normalcy. Peter Parker, that we grew up with, actually ends up coming back during an event, during a crisis, and they fight alongside each other. Ben and him end up fighting the Green Goblin, and this is where we find out who the true clone was. Peter Parker and Ben Reilly are fighting the Green Goblin, my bad. And they have this debacle with him that he is trying so hard to kill one of the Spider-Men, but is failing. And eventually, there's kind of a little bit of a distraction as there's two Spider-Man fighting one villain, and since the Green Goblin has a glider, he sends his glider off. It impales Ben Reilly, and Ben Reilly dies. And he kind of crumbles into nothingness, and this tells Peter he must have been the clone, because if he wouldn't have been the clone, then there would have been a dead body. He wouldn't have crumbled away like all the other clones had before. Peter Parker then decides to spread out Ben Reilly's ashes across the city rooftops of New York. After a long period of time, Ben Reilly has actually recently returned to comics, seemingly from the dead, and he actually has come back as, well, the Jackal. He became the new Jackal, the man that created all these spider clones in the first place. And that's really the history of Ben Reilly in the spider suit so far. Now we'll take a look at the spider suit and what is kind of unique about it. This spider suit is, as you can tell, it's just a straight red variant of what Peter would wear, with maybe a little bit of padding, but the main thing is that he has a hoodie on, which contains his spider symbols, and his spider symbols are kind of turned sideways and more of a graphically, I would kind of say, edgier, graffiti sprayed spider that's on his hoodie. An interesting thing I will mention about this costume, though, is that the actual cords that could tighten the hood up are actually dangling on this costume, which I think is kind of unique and really cool attention to detail. Now, you actually see a semblance of the old web shooters Spider-Man had back in the day on Ben Reilly right now, because you actually get to see the cartridges, and you see this one long cartridge that is actually a cartridge on the back of a web shooter that's pushed in, and he just spins his webs from there. And you can actually see a utility belt that holds more cartridges, and you see ones on his ankles that if he runs out of the ones on his belt and hands, he has more to use from. And you will notice that actually the eyepieces look a little bit more menacing than your typical Spider-Man. They're slightly larger and have a curved point at the top, which overall makes him seem just a tad bit more malevolent. And that's honestly really all to cover with this suit, and there's the history of and everything else. So if y'all really did like this, let me know. And I need y'all to remember one thing: you don't have to be qualified to be a professional. Peace out. I'll see y'all in the next one.